Josh Craddock is here with us to discuss a little bit of a lighter subject. It might not feel as light because it's legal, but the 14th Amendment protections for life are so important. We heard about them from Carter Snead earlier when we kicked off our coverage, and it is the subject of discussion at your organization as well. Live Action, right? Founded by Lyla Rose?
Yeah.
Yeah, and to give folks a little bit of insight on who you are, you have this very long title. You're a Harvard-educated lawyer, and you are a legislative strategist with Live Action, as Monsi mentioned, and affiliated scholar at the James Wilson Institute on Natural Rights and the American Founding.
Yes.
That's right. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Now, many in the pro-life movement think that we're done because Dobbs came in, Roe is over, Casey is over, and you know that that's not true. What is really happening here? Where are we right now?
Well, for the last 50 years, the goal of the pro-life movement was the overturn of Roe v. Wade, right? For 50 years, we fought that battle, and finally in 2022, with the Dobbs decision, that goal was accomplished. But the North Star of our movement has always been the equal protection of unborn children, just like you and I, right? That the same laws that protect you and I from acts of violence would also protect unborn children. And so that's the North Star of our movement, and that's what I see as the next goal of the pro-life movement after the overturn of Roe through the Dobbs decision.
And Josh, can you explain, kind of in layman's terms, to take a step back for a minute, what the 14th Amendment is, what it does, the protections it holds?
Well, a century and a half ago, we fought a civil war to ensure that every human being would be equally protected by the laws. And that culminated in a series of constitutional amendments, one of which was the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed that no state shall deprive any person of the equal protection of the laws. Okay? And so 150 years ago, who was a person? Well, in 1868, it was actually well established that unborn children in the womb were considered persons. So state high courts throughout the country declared that the unborn child in the womb, quote, is a person, and is to all intents and purposes has the same rights as a child as much as if born, right? That was Justice Shaw of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court way back in the mid-1800s.
Amazing.
And so leading up to the amendment's adoption, it was very clear that unborn children were considered persons and would have that same protection as you or I.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that that's not a no-brainer anymore to some people.
Oh, it's not, and it's definitely, it's a legal agenda behind that to be able to limit or control fertility. We just talked about that with a couple of doctors. But from a legal perspective as well, when you look at what happened with Roe, they directly went to the 14th Amendment. A lot of people think this is a novel strategy, but it's not. What happened with Roe? What did it actually do to the 14th Amendment?
Well, Roe was perverse because it took what was supposed to be this protective amendment guaranteeing equal protection to every human being, and it found within the word liberty or the penumbras of privacy a right to abortion. And so thankfully the Supreme Court in Dobbs corrected that and showed with all the historical evidence that abortion was never considered a liberty or a right under the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment was designed to be a new birth of freedom for all human beings and to protect every human being equally in the state. So a state, if it provides the protection of criminal law or tort remedies in tort to a certain class of persons, it can't withhold those remedies or those protections from a disfavored minority group.
But it certainly did, right? So when you're talking about the way that these standards were developed, you had the viability standard in Casey, where you're talking about the number of weeks where you can have an abortion, right? 22 weeks-ish. And you also have this thing that created what Carter Snead called this morning a super right. So the undue burden standard. So you talk about how before the baby in the womb was protected. When we created this right to abortion, the undue burden standard really is what trumped life in the womb, right?
Yeah, so the Supreme Court's decisions in Roe and Casey, where they developed that undue burden standard, they really botched the 14th Amendment. And so when Dobbs reversed the core holding of Roe, which was that there was a constitutional right to abortion, that corrected a large part of the problem. But part of Roe that people don't understand is that it also held that the unborn child is not a person within the meaning of the 14th Amendment. And so the court didn't need to address that question to decide Dobbs, but I think it lays out the strategy for where we go from here, where Congress can legislate under Section 5 of the amendment, which grants authority to Congress to enforce by appropriate legislation the guarantees in Section 1, and also shows where the litigation and the courts are going to move in the future. This is where the battle's going to be.
Right, right. And Josh, you know, federal legislation has not been top of mind for some of our movements since the overturn of Roe, since these pro-life laws have spilled into the states. It's happening on the state level. Why has Live Action kind of taken this up as their new North Star?
Well, I think it's important to remember that abortion is still a federal issue, right? We can see the Biden administration firing on all cylinders to try and force states to allow abortions, and also through all the departments and agencies of the federal government to promote abortion. So I think it's important for pro-lifers to remember that abortion is a federal issue,
right,
and that our existing Constitution, properly interpreted, guarantees the protections to unborn children that we can use to continue to fight in the states that have these radical abortion laws, like my home state of Colorado.
Yeah, Josh, you're really breaking this up. For those of us that aren't legal geeks, you're really, hitting this home. You're breaking this down for us. Even I can understand it. So thank you, Josh. What do you think is the best strategy to save lives in the womb? What would you say?
Well, I think all of the above, right? So I think we need to continue fighting at the federal level, urging Congress to pass legislation to guarantee equal protection. The next pro-life president should issue an executive order instructing all the departments and agencies under his authority to advance this interpretation of the Constitution. I think the courts, if presented with the proper case to decide this question, should follow the original meaning of our Constitution to enforce equal protection. And then, of course, we can't forget the states, which is where the primary battleground remains.
Right.
And we have to continually remind people that our Constitution was the reason why we had the 14th Amendment in the first place, was to correct a gross human rights abuse where certain human beings were excluded from the human family and not treated as full persons. And that's the same thing we see today with abortion. And so that's where the fight is in the states. We have to keep fighting there as well.
Yeah.
What are we looking at then when we talked about the definition of the human person and the levels, the different levels there, different restrictions, but we haven't talked about the definition of abortion. And one of those differences really is in medical, or the different pills that people can take, medical abortions versus surgical abortions. Do you see there being a difference in the legal treatment of different kinds of abortions?
No, I don't think so. I think that some pro-abortion advocates try and obfuscate between the direct and intentional killing of an unborn child and things like miscarriage treatment, right? Trying to muddy the waters by saying that somehow treatment for a miscarriage is abortion. And that's simply not correct, right? But in terms of, medical abortion versus surgical abortion, it doesn't really matter the method that they use to kill the unborn child. That unborn child is still protected and has God-given and constitutionally protected rights.
That's really great. I know that Prudence has interviewed Lyla Rose many, many times, and Tracy was talking about these issues in layman's terms. And Live Action, in my mind, there's no one who does that better, who really kind of brings to the forefront how to take some of these complicated issues and break them down. I know that you interviewed Lila, you've interviewed her multiple times, but in particular on why this is the North Star, and we've got that here for our audience. We can take a listen to that sound from her.
In the wake of the overruling of Roe v. Wade, which was the most unjust Supreme Court decision in our history, the North Star for the movement is acknowledging equal protection under the law without compromise for all human beings born and preborn. Yes. And this is already promised under our Constitution, under the 14th Amendment, which has an equal protection clause. So already today in America, preborn children have a constitutional right to life, and it is now time for the federal and all state law to reflect that.
Josh, coming out of Harvard, it's surprising that you speak the way you do and share the sentiments that you do about the live issue. What was it like studying there? Well,
Harvard Law School can be a hostile place for people who promote the sanctity of life or family. And I did, there were places and times when other students, were hostile to those views. But I was thankful that I was able to share my view on life and also develop these arguments that ended up becoming my law journal article on this 14th Amendment personhood. And so I'm just thankful for the opportunity to have been there, to have interacted with the students there, and to advocate for life there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just heard from Lila. That was last year when we celebrated the year anniversary of the overturn of Roe. How has kind of the work been on Capitol Hill in engaging members on this strategy?
Well, I think that the work is ongoing. There's a lot of education to be done, right? Reminding people that abortion is not just a state issue, that there is a federal role to play is really important. But I've been encouraged by the buy-in that we have seen from members who are taking up this baton and relying on the 14th Amendment in their legislation.
Yeah. Well, Josh, it's been an honor to have you here. Thanks for joining us and for breaking all of this down. It's an honor to have you.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Absolutely.